So you should have some handouts called high performance tools. So I want to give you 2 or 3 things. We're probably going to skip one piece of this for the sake of time, but I do want to talk about the very first thing under high performance tools is upgrade your meetings. Yes. So this one is so practical and it's not sexy, but I wish I'd had someone help me with this 30 years ago. So it has been said, if you want to kill time, a meeting is a perfect weapon. And so I want you to imagine this. You've been there. We've all been there. You're sitting in a meeting, and the meeting is supposed to come to the end at 2 o'clock. And it's 1:58. And everybody in the room is starting to get a little bit antsy. And, you know, you get restless. You begin shutting down your computer, and you put your stuff in your backpack. You discreetly glance at your phone to see what text messages might have come in, you know, during the meeting, and your mind has already shifted to the next thing on your agenda, maybe the next meeting in your day, and the meeting ends and it's 2:02 and you're in a hurry and you're out the door, and here's what never happens. Nobody ever stops and asks, was that an effective meeting? Was that a good meeting? Did we accomplish what we needed to? So I'm going to tell you now. Is this on camera?
It is.
Okay. Oh, it's okay. Rick probably knows this. So when I was at Saddleback, Rick was like he loved new and ideas, and so sometimes he'd have this like brainstorm an idea, and then he would go, I want to have a meeting. And the meeting was not like, who are the key people that should be in the room? It was, who's around the building? And so sometimes you'd get 15, 16, 17 people in a meeting that had no agenda, no direction, no destination. It was to talk and process out loud this idea, right? And sometimes those meetings would go 2, 2.5, 3 hours. And we would walk out of the meeting, and I would go, what was that? And then in my more cynical moments, I would figure up how much salary we just spent on that 3-hour meeting. And I would go, that was not a $15,000 meeting. That was a $300 meeting. And I just think it raises the importance of like, a lot of how we get stuff done is through meetings, but we can do them better. So listen to some data I have. Professionals lose 31 hours a month in unproductive meetings, roughly 4 work days. Most professionals attend 61 meetings a month. Research says that over 50% of meetings is typically wasted. In one study, 73% said they brought other work to meetings, and 39% they have said they have dozed off at some point during a meeting. So here's what else I know to be true. Your church spends a lot of valuable time and resource on meetings. Your team wants to be helpful and productive. It's frustrating to walk away from meetings that feel like it was a waste of everybody's time. And so we can do a better job of stewarding those. So I've given you a couple of handouts. You may have them printed or on your iPad. One's called the Effective Meeting Components. Can you just take a quick look at that? This is a way, Andy, can I borrow your sheet for just a minute?
One or the next one?
It's both of them. Let me show this one first. So this one, the idea is that you would take these 9 different components of an effective meeting and rate them on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 being poorly done, 5 being great, okay? And what I would love for you to do, we probably won't have time to do this today, but for the meetings that you lead, give yourself an evaluation. And then let your team fill this out on how effective the meetings are. Come on. Wait, I thought you guys want to talk about being productive. Oh, you don't? You just want everybody to bow down and kind of say, yes, Lord. So start and end on time, clear purpose and agenda, stay on topic. And then the other sheet that you've got is we've given you specific ways to define what each of these 9 statements mean. All right? So that there's no ambiguity around when we say, stay on topic. Well, what does that mean? Well, we've actually defined it in the other sheet. Make sense?
Yes, thank you. So good.
So I would just encourage you to take this back and evaluate it and sit down with your team. And by the way, I would say your people ought to fill it out on themselves for the meetings they lead, right? And that we can get better. So let me just talk with you about what I've learned now through all these years about doing effective meeting. The most important part, this goes back to your outline, the most important part of any meeting is the landing. And yet I would say it is the most neglected part of most meetings. It is the norm to walk out of church meetings without clear decisions, clear action steps, and clear deliverables. So I have spent the last 20 years a lot of time on airplanes. And I'll tell you what I've noticed. I've never been on a flight where the pilot neglected the landing. Because it doesn't matter how good the snacks are or the movies are or how clean the bathrooms were. If the landing doesn't work, the whole flight's a disaster, right? And by the way, it's the pilot's job to land the plane. So if you're leading the meeting, it's your job to get the meeting to its good conclusion. It's not the people in the room. It's not the passenger's responsibility. And as far as meetings go, it doesn't matter how good, again, the agenda is or how many snacks were in the room. If you don't land it well, it's an organizational disaster and wreck. And so I've developed this strategy for how to have good, effective meetings. And I would say to you on a practical level, that next statement in your notes, set aside the last 10 to 15 minutes to successfully land the meeting. So you know that moment when you're on the plane and you're about 30 minutes out from the destination and you can feel the slight tilt of the plane downward? That begins the slow descent to the runway. And it takes time to go from 35,000 feet down to the ground, right?
You haven't put it on there, mate.
Okay. Well, that's a fact. So but you don't wait till you get over the runway and then do the deep dive, right? So here's 3 questions. So I would go, if I had a meeting that was going to end at 2:00, about 1/4 till or 10 till, my mind begins that subtle shift downward toward the landing. And it's done with these 3 questions. So question 1, what did we decide? How many times I have walked out of a meeting and I thought we made a decision on something and everybody else thought we were still just chatting about it. And so I went out and started to execute, and I created chaos and confusion because we weren't really clear did we decide. So here's the question I like to ask. What is still a discussion and what's a decision? That has been so helpful to clarify, because if it's a decision we made, now we move into execution mode. Yep. But if it's a discussion, there's still more conversation that has to take place. But I think doing that, and what I've noticed about myself, the older I get and the longer I've been doing this, that I find myself in meetings when it's my meeting to facilitate, I am pushing for clear decisions. Yeah. I'm often saying, okay, can we make a decision on this? Are we landing a decision? Or do we need to keep circling that same mountain again? And I don't know about you guys, but I've been in lots of meetings where, one, because we didn't take good notes from the meeting before, we came back and we rehashed the same stuff over and over again. So I'm like going, is there any new information we need before we can make a decision, or are we going to make a decision? Because once the decision is made, now we can move into execution mode. And I feel like because we're not good at this, you guys know the movie Groundhog Day? Yeah. You live the same day over and over. I've lived the same meeting over and over because we weren't clear about what decisions we made, what was still discussion, and we didn't have good notes to go on. Second question, who needs to know what we decided? So I've done lots of assessments and surveys with church staff. See you, Sam. All right. Safe flight.
Got the minutes still for the next meeting.
All right, good job. And if you sit down with virtually every church team and you go, give me the top 3 weaknesses of your church staff, they're going to go communication. It always shows up on the list at some point. And so the correlation to what did we decide now follows with who needs to know what we just decided. And until we're clear about our decisions, we can't be clear about our communication. I feel like for me, it is helpful, and often I use a whiteboard for this, to actually write down the decisions we made. Because if it's just verbal, Chris's interpretation and my interpretation of the decision can sometimes be different. So a lot of times I will write down the decisions on the whiteboard and then I'm taking a photo of the whiteboard. And I tell the other people in the room, take a photo of this. So we all have a record of what we actually decided. And I love that quote from George Bernard Shaw. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Right? So the question, who needs to know what we decided, forces us before we leave the room to ask the question, who should know about what just took place in here? One of the biggest morale busters on a church staff is when people on the team find out about a decision on a Sunday morning in a worship service. Yeah. And especially when that decision impacts them. Yeah. So I think what we unintentionally do is we devalue our team by not communicating appropriately and in a timely fashion. But also the flip side is we can show great honor to the team by actually getting them ahead and communicating to them on the, early on in the process of a decision. And Patrick Lencioni talks about cascading communication down through the organization. So I think a question you want to get in the habit of asking is, who do I need to inform about what happened in here? And I would even use the language of decision and discussion. Like, hey, we made this decision. I know you know that we were going to talk about this. We haven't landed a decision yet. It's still in the discussion phase, so we're not doing anything about that yet. So I think to just get clear about that is really, really helpful. Question 3 is, who's responsible for the decision we made and what are the key deliverables? So one of the things I like to do when we write down decisions on the board is I want to know who's owning this. Because when everybody owns it, nobody owns it. So who is the name of the person that needs to feel the weight of the responsibility for driving this thing forward? Doesn't mean they're going to do it all, but they're owning driving the decision forward and taking the initiative and us getting progress on that. Now, again, if you have a small team and whatever, this might feel like overkill, but I still think it's important, even in a small team, to go through these 3 questions. Yeah. What did we decide? Who needs to know? Who's responsible? And key deliverables are, here's the decision, but what are the 1 or 2, 3 bullet points that are key deliverables? Like maybe one of them is, we've got to, reserve a space for a certain event. Or we're planning a training and one of the key deliverables is we need to have the curriculum outlined by such and such date. And I'm a huge fan of putting dates by the decision and especially when it comes to the key deliverables. Because otherwise it gets real squishy, right? The date helps us know. And then the other thing I am always saying to people is go on your calendar before you leave right now and put this date on your action list. Or put it somewhere, however you keep up with your daily list of stuff, you've got to make sure you don't lose this. Like this is on your radar. All right, the second most important part of any meeting is the takeoff. So again, and I usually ask it in these 2 ways. What's the win of this meeting? And then what's the desired outcome? So when we get to the end of the hour or the half hour or the hour and a half, how will we know if this meeting has been successful? And again, I feel like if I'm the pilot, this takeoff defines the destination. It's my job as the pilot to make sure that we deliver on what we said was the purpose of this meeting. If it's to make these couple of decisions or whatever, and I realize sometimes meetings we're doing a check-in, that's okay. And that may be part of the purpose. But then if there's actual decisions we need to get to, I want to make sure that those are actually identified on the front end. And it's amazing how many times I've been in a meeting and you go, what's the win? And you just met with blank stares. Well, the win is, hey, we do this every week at 2 o'clock. Like, well, wow, that sounds very productive, So I think establishing the discipline of asking what's the desired outcome or what's the win can be helpful. And then the third, gosh, this one's been so helpful to me. The third most important part of any meeting is the 10 minutes after the meeting. So think about when the plane lands and it taxis off of the runway and goes over to the terminal and it pulls up to the jetway and they open the doors. You know who doesn't get off first? The pilot. The pilot's usually the last one off because they've got some paperwork to do to really wrap up the flight. And I would say the 10 minutes after the meeting, scheduling breaks, and at Saddleback, we did back-to-back meetings. It was no time to catch your breath or to transition appropriately from one meeting to the next. And by now, me scheduling time between like my coaching calls and different meetings, I now take a few minutes and I capture all of the stuff that I need to have going out of that meeting. So if I said I'm going to follow up with someone or I have an action item, the other thing I do is I take the decisions that we made in the key deliverables and I transfer them to my notes for our next meeting. So that the very first thing we're going to cover is what you said you were going to get done in our last meeting. And I think the discipline of that builds an accountability into people actually executing on, like, dates actually mean something, and that your name is by an action item actually means something. And so I think giving yourself a little bit of buffer in between those things can help you be able to capture the notes, get the decisions down, think about any communication that you want to make. A couple of other just sort of random thoughts on this. I think one of the things I would say is often we tend to think of meetings in 30-minute and hour-long increments. I think that's a mistake. I think you want to think of meetings in terms of what does this meeting actually need? Sometimes you may go, you know what, we just need a stand-up meeting. Because you get people in a room, they sit down, they open their computers, they get a snack. We're 20 minutes in and we haven't even started anything. So sometimes you might go, you know what, I just need 5 minutes of everybody's time. What's everybody working on today? Here's 2 things I want you guys to know. A stand-up meeting is a great thing. I think sometimes instead of going, we may not need an hour, we may be able to get everything done this week in 30 minutes. No one's ever unhappy with you when they get back 30 minutes of their day. So I think evaluating how long do we actually need, and then I found that as I push for clear decisions where I'm often saving time. Instead of us continuing to bat something around, I'm pushing for decisions and we actually trim down the length of the meeting. So I think really thinking through like how long do you actually need? And then one of the things that Patrick Lencioni talks about in his book, Death by Meeting, is to separate the tactical from the strategic. So most of our meetings are tactical and more granular. So we're talking about this weekend's upcoming service, announcements that have to be done, some special, exhibit that we're going to have on the weekend or something like that. And so what I would say about tactical meetings is there's more topics, they're more right now, and they're not as organizationally weighty. Strategic meetings, we cover less topics, they take longer to discuss. They're usually more forward thinking, like maybe 3 to 6 months out, and they're big deals. So like if we're going to have a meeting right now to talk about Easter 2025, that would be a strategic meeting. And by the way, sometimes I think you want to let the nature of the meeting determine who's in the meeting. So if you're trying to do kind of creative, innovative, blue sky thinking about what we could do at Easter next year, you may want to get just some creative, maybe your youth pastor's got a real creativity streak in them. Get him or her in the room, and then your process people that want to quickly talk about how and calendar and budget, don't let them in the dream meeting. They're in the follow-up meeting once we move to execution. So I remember when I started working with Rick Warren, the guy that'd been with Rick a long time, he said, let me tell you something. When Rick is in vision casting mode, don't go into problem-solving mode, because you will watch him just glaze over. You start asking budget questions, calendar, facility questions, like you lose him. He hates those. In fact, I remember he said this to me. He goes, if an idea has in it steps A to Z, Rick will see step A, sometimes step B, maybe occasionally step C. But he never sees K, L, M, N, never. And by the time you are there, he's bored with the idea and on to the next thing. So, I'm just kidding, Rick. No, but I think seriously, like, you know, to have the right kind of people in the room for the right thing. So here's how we did this at Saddleback. I tried to make our meetings 3 times a month tactical and once a month strategic. And then we would have on the whiteboard what I called the parking lot. And anytime we were in a strategic meeting and a real down in the weeds issue came up, we put it on the parking lot and said, we'll talk about that next week. And when we were in a tactical meeting and a big strategic, like out in the distance issue came up, we'd put that on the parking lot, and I would capture that for our strategic meeting that we were going to have once a month. And our strategic meeting was usually anywhere from 2 to 3 hours. Our tactical meetings were around an hour, hour and 15, typically.